For today's enrichment, you are going to make your own motion story. Your motion story will have several requirements that will need to be included, and you'll also need to make a graph based off of your motion story. Some things to keep in mind. First of all, you're going to need to include 6 total motion changes. 4 of them must be different. In class, we've learned about the motions of constant speed, rapid steady speed, no movement, acceleration, deceleration, and return to start. Those were your 6 total motion changes that you have learned. You must include at least 4 of them. That means you can duplicate several. When you describe your motion, you need to include the requirements that are written here. For each storyline, you'll probably include 2 sentences. In your sentences, you need to include the speed or the motion that you've chosen. You need to say for how many meters and in how many minutes or seconds. It's important that you pay attention to those things as you're creating your story. It's also important that you look at your graph before you begin. You'll notice in your graph that your numbers are already labeled on the X and Y axis. It's important that when making your story, you take that into consideration. For some students, they make their graph first and then create their story. You want to utilize as much of your graph as possible. That's why the numbers are important. If you make your whole story and your graph only takes up half of the graph, then that won't look very good. So make sure you're utilizing as much of the graph as possible. Once your graph is complete, you're going to fill in the table like you see here. This is the table that's very similar to what we did for the passing periods. You're going to fill in the coordinates for the X and Y at each of your story points. One thing you might want to consider is A, which is the first part of your story up here. You might want to say where they're starting in the story. That means you might start at 0, 0. So for example, in this part of your story, you might say Griffin starts in the classroom, and that's all you would need to put. So if you're just having your starting point be 0, 0, you don't need to include that in your story. Once you create the graph, you need to make sure that you include the following information. First of all, each point on the graph should be labeled with the appropriate letter. That means A through G, as you see above. Each line that you do should be a different color. So that means you're going to have 6 or 7, depending on the length of your story, different colors on your graph. Please make sure that you've included a title for your graph, and that should not just be my motion story. Your title should be specific to the story you're writing about. Your X and Y axis should be labeled with the distance, time, and what units you are using. And then finally, your graph should be neat and easy to read. Use a ruler for any straight edges. And again, make sure that it's neat and easy to read because you're going to be using this in the next part of the assignment, which we'll explain tomorrow. If at any point you have questions, make sure you ask 3 students before you ask Mrs. H or Mr. Vaughn, as it's important that they are working with the reteach students. Please also make sure that you're using a pencil on this assignment in case you need to make any changes along the way. Finally, in your story, you are welcome to use any names, celebrities, cartoon characters. If you're using any student names, make sure you have permission from them first. It can be as silly as you'd like it to be, or it can be serious. But just make it creative and have fun with it. Good luck.